Hey everyone, a really warm welcome back. In this episode I want to talk through our experiences of towing and carrying bikes at the same time, because it might be a little bit different to usual. Anyway, let's get into the video. Everybody ready? Good, then let's get going. Oh, nearly forgot you guys. Throughout the episode I'll mention a few different carriers that we've used, and rather than making this a huge documentary length video, at the same time I'm releasing individual videos for each of those products. None of them are sponsored or anything like that, of course. They're all personal views and stuff we've paid full price for. And so those reviews sit alongside this introductory video as part of a sort of mini-series. The one product that I'll mention here, but that I won't actually publish the video for right now, is the Fiamma rack that I now have for the tailgate on our T6 Caravan. That video will come out as part of the Building the Ultimate Family Day Van and Occasional Camper series that I've got planned for late on in the year. So this video is the overview of how we did things a little bit differently and what we did and why. So first things first, and with the aid, of course, of Lego. Now this is what happens if your children have many different interests and you give them the instruction manual for a car and caravan and they've got far too many things to be doing, you get just the chassis anyway. And furthermore, they will have lost the bicycles. So we will be using this slimline motorbike as our bicycle for the day. So the very safest thing, of course, in terms of towing dynamics and physics is to have your, let's pretend this is a bicycle, your couple of bicycles on top of the car, well, up here somewhere. But to have the weight distributed so it's equally across all the wheels and then pushing down equally on the tow car. So of course if it's a car they can go on the top. If it's a pickup or a van or something they could go, I guess, inside the back or perhaps on the back if you can get a suitably strong tonneau cover and mount some bike racks to that. So why on the tow vehicle specifically? Well, simply to optimise the towing performance by having the ratio of the weight of the tow car to the weight of the trailer as much in favour of the car as possible, and that gives the greatest stability. Obviously though, be mindful of the overall and both the axle weights on the tow car to make sure you're within the limits and therefore safe. So some car and caravan combinations can also be used, of course, with those carriers that strap onto the back. So I guess it would go sort of there somewhere, wouldn't it? And then that straps onto the tailgate or the rear window. But of course this restricts your turning circle. So as you're moving, and obviously you have to be very mindful not to be crashing the front of the caravan into one of the wheels of the bikes. This has got a very long drawbar on this one, but you get what I mean. So it does reduce that turning circle a bit, so it'll only work safely if the back of the car is the right shape and your A-frame or the drawbar itself is long enough. And then in this configuration you need to be aware not only of the turning circle but also of the weight on this rear axle. Because you've got the bikes behind the rear axle, you've got not just the weight of the bikes on there, but also you've got the weight that's on the tow ball as well, all of that pushing down on the rear axle, so it's much easier to inadvertently overload that, hence needing to be aware of the weights. So not only is this bad for the rear axle in terms of the stress placed on that directly, but if you're pushing down very heavily here, then obviously to an extreme, that brings the front up. So, you know, this is the demonstration of why you have to be very careful with your nose weight, because actually what it's doing is taking pressure off of the front and therefore it's reducing the braking efficiency on the front wheels. And obviously in this configuration it's impossible to carry any more than about 1 or 2 bikes. So whilst having them on the roof does compromise your aerodynamics, you know, that's nowhere near as much compromising as having a giant box of air attached to the rear, so I don't think it's really worth worrying about. The plus side, other than stability, of course, is that you've got your carriers attached to your tow vehicle, so if you want to drop your caravan off somewhere and drive off, then you've still got your bike carriers all attached to the car. Unfortunately, neither of those on-car setups would work for us. As you know, I mostly caravan in solo parent mode, so getting 3 bikes up there is nigh on impossible. Yeah, if not a bit dangerous. Clearly not going to happen on this one. And although we've got a long A-frame, so a boot lid rack was a possibility for us when we were towing exclusively with a Volvo. So this is the sportier, the slightly lower XC60, and that means as well as being lower, it's got a bit of body kit on, which includes this spoiler on the back, and we really didn't want any straps or racks or anything resting on that or rubbing. When we first wanted to take bikes with us, we had the folding camper, so we opted for a max rack. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? As it's the only rack that meant that it would mount onto our swan neck, so the removable swan neck tow ball on the Volvo itself, and still leave the ball available for the trailer. Anyway, as I said, there's a more detailed separate video, so please do go and check that out. There'll be one that I have had to put it together from old photos and website clips and so on, because I wasn't recording anything for the channel way back then. So that worked really well with the folding camper, because we were only carrying little lightweight bikes, and so hardly any weight from those, and we didn't need much of a weight allowance for the nose weight of the camper relative to a big caravan, obviously. Then we switched up to the Holt camper trailer tent, and it's built in 4 bike racks. Now that should have been an absolute dream come true with its super stylish design and space and practicality and so on. But what it actually turned into was an absolutely soaking disaster, because the kids' bit leaked like bilio where it attached to the adults' bits, and all the dealer did to test it, maybe they didn't believe me despite the videos of pints of water inside, was to put it up in their totally flat and carpeted showroom. And that apparently was good enough to prove that I must have been putting it up wrong, and therefore the cause of the water inside. Anyway, the least said about that the better. It was a very disappointing and frustrating few months with what should have been a premium product. So if you want to see pints of water pooling in the area where the kids were supposed to be sleeping on ground mats, do go and check out the video that I made about it a couple of years ago. So that brought us to our current caravan, the Ariba Feeling. The Feeling's heavier than anything we've towed before, but still only 1400 kilos MTPLM. But it does tow best with a sensible nose weight, obviously. The Volvo has a max nose weight allowance of 75 kilos, so we no longer had the capacity for the bikes on the max racks and the Caravan with a sensibly heavy front end. So that was the end of the max racks, and we had to think of a different plan. What we do have, though, compared to most UK manufactured vans, is a massive payload and a long A-frame, so at least there were possibilities in terms of the Caravan itself. Just a quick side note though, if you're thinking of an Ariba or you own one already, printed payloads can be a bit deceptive on Aribas, so do be careful. When you buy one new, there's a huge list of options, and of course none of these are included in the stated minimum weight, the MIRO, of course. And of course they're not included because they're options. Even things like batteries and different types of upholstery and so on are not included in the standard weight. So it's a bit misleading to compare the weight of the Ariba with weights of UK vans, for example, because there's much less included in the empty weight. However, the options list does incredibly clearly tell you how many extra kilograms you add, as well as how many pound notes you require for that option. And it's quite a few. So, for example, our model, the 425, comes as standard on a 1300 kilogram MTPLM chassis. We had ours upgraded, so not just a plating upgrade, but an actually different chassis, and that was done at the factory when it was built. So we had it put onto a 1400 kilogram chassis, which added an extra 100 kilograms of payload. But of course, the chassis itself weighed an extra 10 kilos through extra chunkier metal and so on. But in the end, of course, we did gain an extra 90 kilos in actual real payload, so it was definitely worth the upgrade in that case. Anyway, sorry for this side. Thought I should mention that before somebody comments that Ariba payloads are misleading, because indeed they are if you don't add in your options. Anyway, back to bikes. So given that I can't safely load bikes onto the roof of the Volvo, and that the Feeling, even when fully loaded, is well within the towing limits of the Volvo itself, in fact, I'm now towing with a bus. So technically I could tow almost 2 of those if they were on the standard chassis and multiple trailers are allowed. But anyway, so we decided to do a bit of an experiment before we splashed out hundreds of pounds on bike carriers for various places on the Feeling. And we decided to put the 3 bikes inside the van, strapped onto the front rail, so there's a convenient metal rail at the front to do with the table configuration. And then we padded the sides out to try and wedge them in, because obviously we didn't want to be fitting D-loops and things at that point if we knew that it wasn't a workable solution. And very clearly it wasn't. So had I made up the front bed and led one of the bikes horizontally across that and then put another one on the rear bed, and we had picnic blankets and so on underneath to protect the upholstery, then that might have worked. But getting 3 bikes inside the Caravan was unworkable. It was just unwieldy to have that much stuff inside. It just blocked everything in terms of possibly using the Caravan on the way if you were doing a big long journey. But also moving them around inside such a small space was really difficult, and securing them and keeping everything clean with muddy bikes and so on. So for this type of bike and for this many bikes, it was definitely a no-no. You know, if we were into carbon fibre racing bikes and the wheels came off and they went in specialist travel pouches, then that would have been a lot more realistic. But for a normal set of family bikes, then no, it was a definite no-no. There is one thing that all my scientific instincts tell me never ever to do, and that's to load much weight on the rear of a Caravan. Now, I know historically some little Rebas have had rear racks, and these days there are rear strengthening carrier bars fitted to some UK-made Caravans to encourage folks to fit bike racks back there. We've all, for example, seen articles like this with the classic loading diagram in, of course, lightweight items in the yellow, medium weight in the green, and the heavy stuff directly over the axle in the middle. So what's your everyday, perfectly ordinary Caravanner supposed to think? On one hand, you've got all these articles and advice and so on from insurance companies, and that's all absolutely consistent with what the clubs will tell you and their technical departments about how to load things safely and stably to give you the best towing experience and also the safest towing experience. And on the other, you've got manufacturers installing points in the back of Caravans where the articles suggest that you should not be loading such heavy things as bikes, especially that high up. And you've got dealers and retailers obviously selling you the kit that enables you to do that. I mean, here's one, for example, for a Thule Elite G2, which is supposed to fit on Swift Caravans, and it comes as standard as 2 bikes. But as you can see, this particular listing from one dealership says, oh, you can upgrade it to 3 or 4 bikes with sets sold separately. And then apparently this is a really well thought out solution. And you simply pop your bikes on the back of your new Swift Group Caravan or motorhome, and then make the most of your touring vacation. Now, motorhome, fine, you know, there's 4 wheels on the ground. But on a Caravan, with 2 wheels just in the middle, and just imagine that, 4 bikes. So high up on the back of a Caravan, 4 bikes up to 60 kilos. Really? And that's assuming you've even got enough payload anyway. I mean, by the time you've accounted for the weight for the bikes and the weight for the bike rack itself, you're probably over payload, even if the Caravan is otherwise completely empty. This is crazy. For example, have you seen this bit of footage? Now obviously this is an extreme, because not only is it moving the weight to the back, but it's also lost all of its nose weight on the front. But you know, if you're going to put, let's say, 2 bikes, so I don't know, 25 kilos, something like that, 25-30 kilos on the back of the Caravan, then obviously you're going to have the same weight, exactly the same distance forward of the axle to maintain the normal nose weight you'd expect. So if you've got 25-30 kilos on the back and an extra 25-30 kilos pushed forward to give you the right sort of nose weight, what on earth is that doing to the payload, let alone any stability issues? And of course, I'm sure there are people who will say, oh, it's fine, my giant twin axle doesn't sway with bikes on. Or all our continental cousins in their fence and hobbies and LMCs and Heimers and so on put all their bikes on the back all the time. Or we've been fine with ours, but for me that is a definite no-no. And I would dearly love to see actually all the dynamic towing testing data that was done by whichever bright spark decided having a rear rack on a UK caravan with its normally short drawbar, which of course, unlike continental caravans or US ones, actually have much longer drawbars, so that leads to a much more stable tow anyway. Or of course, US caravans don't even have their road wheels in the middle, you know, they're much further towards the back of the trailer. But of course that does give crazy nose weights, which is why you need a massive pickup to tow anything. But anyway, I would dearly love to see that safety assurance data. So the next move was to invest in a Fiamma Caravan active rack. Again, there's a separate video available showing the assembly, and then I've done another one showing use because there's quite a lot of detail that I wanted to go through in those videos. The rack actually recommended by Heimer for the Ariba feeling is actually a 2-leg Caravan short, but that only takes 2 bikes maximum. So after a bit of research, I found that the dimensions of the Fiamma Caravan Active were actually exactly the same front to back, but it could be fitted with a 3rd bike rail. So we went for that one. It was a very tight fit, but it just about fitted. It was a perfect point that we could get everything far enough back, but not too far forward. The one thing, of course, I hadn't realised before we owned one of these things was that because kids' bikes are much shorter and narrower, there'll be far less room in between the frames, so between the wheels at the bottom and underneath the pedals and that sort of thing, which means winding the jockey wheel is quite interesting when you've got a tiny bike attached at the front, and so that makes life a little bit tricky. So in terms of normal protocol, if we did have 3 bikes on there, then we had to make sure we had the little one off the front in order to hitch up and then put it all on once we were hitched and ready to go, and then obviously the reverse, so take it off before we could unhitch the caravan and sight it and so on. So the downsides of this, like the boot mounted rack, are of course a reduced turning circle and a much heavier nose weight, so both things you need to be incredibly mindful of. Now we were fine with the turning circle because the A-frame's nice and long, and that was able to accommodate the bikes. But I did have 2 different loading setups depending on whether we had bikes on or not, and it did really make me get into the habit of checking the nose weight every single time actually before we left, just to make sure I had it correct. Usually, you know, you'd have a loading setup for your caravan, and as long as everything's in the same sort of place, you'd expect the nose weight to be the same. But because we usually travel with different stuff in different places, I had these 2 different basic setups. The other thing I did to keep the nose weight down was to use Cala Light rather than standard propane cylinders, which helped a bit, although had I known about it at the time, then I would have started caravanning using safe fill, because of course those plastic bottles are much, much lighter. The other thing I did wherever possible was to carry just the 1 bottle, because if all 4 of us are out and we're using the big Cadac, then we need 2 bottles, because we don't yet have a built-in gas point. So that setup worked great for us with the Volvo. The bike carrier did slightly hamper access to the gas locker. It could be tipped fully out of the way once all the bikes were off of it, because they were little ones. If they were big ones, theoretically they could be tipped over the jockey wheel handle and the handbrake and so on. But even when it was tipped out the way, it did restrict slightly where you could stand. The other downside, of course, is that I had to have a separate carrier for the car if we wanted to cycle anywhere that didn't involve parking the caravan directly next to where we wanted to start our cycle, which is why this series also includes assembly and our thoughts about the Altea Strata DL towable mounted rack, which we used. It's a great rack, really solid, though in practice it really is too bulky to carry as an extra bit of luggage within the caravan itself. So practically day to day that meant I didn't take it anywhere, and we had to start our rides from wherever we were staying. Although now that we've got the rack on the bus itself, then I really must get round to selling it on, because we tend to take the bus wherever we're going rather than the Volvo, which needs the Strata rack. If I were buying new again, I would look at the Westfalia Bikelander. Jules and Karina from Here We Tow did a really great review of that carrier, and the reason I'm attracted to it is because it folds up into actually a manageable package, unlike the Strata rack. Mind you, it only seems to take 2 bikes, so it wouldn't work for our family of 4 anyway. But it does look like a nicely built bit of kit, and one that folds up really small, so if you've got just 2 bikes to transport, it might be perfect. So I'll put a link into Jules and Karina's video and you can go and check that out. So then back in October, of course, I collected our VW bus, and all the towing has been done with that ever since then. The bus means that we can go back to an on-car solution, clearly not on the roof, but with an on-car solution, then rides don't need to be directly from the site itself. I've gone for a Fiamma rack, again for two reasons. So this was a Fiamma rack for T6. So why the Fiamma rack rather than the VW branded one? Well, first of all, it sticks out less far from the back of the van. So it's almost about 10 centimetres less when it's in use than the VW branded one. The Fiamma comes as standard as a 2-bike rack, and in that configuration it's even closer when it's in use to the back of the van. But extended with the 3rd and the 4th bike trays on, then it's still much more compact than the VW rack. And that means I can still tow and carry bikes at the same time. And in fact, because the rack is higher than the A-frame mounted one, and the front window of the Caravan slopes away, the turning circle is actually much better with 4 bikes on the back of the bus than it was with 3 bikes on the A-frame rack. I do of course have to be careful how much weight is going on the rear axle, in the same way that other rear mounted carriers have to be thought of. And then the second reason is, and I'm sort of a little bit embarrassed to admit it, that it's purely cosmetic. So the Fiamma rack comes in black, whereas the VW ones only come in aluminium. And as weird as it sounds for a 40-something-year-old mummy to say, it looks badass in black. And I want my bus to have the nice, subtle, but still badass look. So on the downside, having seen them both in the flesh, both racks, I'm not convinced that the Fiamma rack is anywhere near as robust or well made as the VW branded one, which is actually made by Thule anyway. So if you aren't worried about the size hanging out the back of the bus, and you just want a good rack that'll last for a decent amount of time, and silver aluminium colour works for you, then at this point I definitely recommend the VW ones. Interestingly though, since I bought the Fiamma, Thule have released their own branded one, so a Wonderway, which actually looks like quite a nice combination of black and aluminium, so it would suit all sorts of different colour buses. And it comes as standard with 2 bikes, but it can also be upgraded to carry 4. What I can't find though is any sort of dimensions in use, so I'm not sure whether it's as good as the Fiamma in terms of towing with the rack in use, or any better or any worse. Anyway, that's our experience of towing and carrying bikes, and I thought it might be useful to give our full thought process in case you've got similar challenges and you are thinking about the same sort of things that we've thought about. You know, I've no idea why I say we and our all the time. I mean, let's face it, it's my thought process. But you know, I was trained as a scientist, and we always use the plural in science because any contributions that we make are always built on the shoulders of all those who have gone before us. And of course, when it comes to installing these things and it's a 2-person job, then Mike's help is always invaluable. Even if I do wish sometimes that if I'm the one who's actually read the instructions, that we get to do it my way. But anyway, before this descends any further, let me say thanks so much for watching. I hope it was helpful, and bye for now.